Hello and welcome to Post-Sermon Conversation. We are going to be discussing Tim's sermon that he did this last Sunday, February 21st. And so I know the title was we're in Devil's Tactics, and the title was Sloth. But unpack a little bit of kind of the high points of that sermon to bring that back to our mind.
Yeah, so we started with the story of Ivan the Great and the unbaptized arm or the unbaptized sword, and then looking at what are the places in our lives that we're wanting to hold up above the water, so that we get to maintain control of and not give over to God. And then looked at sloth through that lens. Where is it that I don't want to persist in doing the hard things? What am I holding up and not really wanting to give in? And again, going back to the 1 Corinthians 13, when I was a child, I acted, thought, behaved like a child. So when I was a child, that served me to not persist in hard things. There were things I was trying to protect myself from. But is that working for me as an adult? And what do I need to look at to imagine doing the things that God wants me to do to live into that totality, the fulfillment of the person he's created me to be. And then we did an exercise, stepping into the spec and the log dynamic, where we imagined our judgment of somebody who's lazy, somebody who's slothful, and what's the judgment that we're carrying of that person, trying to land on, if I see that speck of laziness or slothfulness in somebody else, how can I own the judgment that I'm making and really see it as the log in my eye, to know, this is what's actually going on in me, that I'm projecting it onto them.
Yeah.
That's the nutshell.
Excellent. Yeah, I loved it. I was really convicted throughout. I thought it was a tremendous use of the story about Ivan the Great. I had not heard that story. That wasn't a familiar story with me. So obviously when I haven't heard something, I'm even more intrigued with it. But that picture is so representative of how I have lived Christianity most of my life. And this is a challenge, I think, for us. When I say, are you a faithful Christian? Everybody gets a little bit different picture in their mind, and I think a lot of people ask themselves, how many times do I attend church? Which, Jesus said he desired mercy, not sacrifice. And the way that sacrifice was showing up in their culture was going, quote, to church, is bringing in their sacrifice. And he's saying, no, I want your heart changed. It's not the amount of attendance. Attendance should be motivated by, I want to be reminded of who I am and what this is about, and be an encouragement to others and be part of the building up of the body of Christ. But it should have never been our measure of what is faithfulness. That's just simply not a biblical measure of, we take the passage out of Hebrews 10, which is emphasizing meet together so you encourage each other. It's not talking about should you meet together. He's saying when you're together, make sure you're doing this. He's not saying take attendance and assess your faithfulness on church attendance. And I'm pro church attendance, because when you go for a while, you miss that. You miss the spirit. You miss the communal experience of connecting around God. But I think that dynamic of what is a faithful Christian, when you define it with those kind of metrics, I go to the right church, and I go enough, or I take communion the right way, or whatever those things are, it creates a space where you can hold this other stuff out. Christians are notorious. It's the stereotype that Christians are not going to tip well. Christians are going to be rude. Christians are going to be impatient. Christians are going to be, every year when we would host the Tulsa workshop, Terry would say, guys, when you go out to eat, tip your waitress, be kind to your waiter. And the reason, and be kind to these custodians, because he was getting feedback that these Christians that came all the way to workshop were not being kind.
Yeah.
And that shows where you're holding something else out. Yes, I'm with Jesus, but the way I treat people, that's not affected, because it doesn't happen in a church building.
Yeah.
And I think that really spoke to me.
My favorite part was, and this is for my coming to this in my study, was realizing people when we're imagining the speck in the log, we won't want to own our log, because will that say to us, well, then we aren't saved. We aren't Jesus's if there's this big thing that I'm not doing right. Like, even when we know that isn't true for somebody else, when it's ourselves, we feel like that's what we are saying, that I must not be a saved Christian if there's this part of me I haven't surrendered. And then realizing, this is what made it my favorite part, was realizing, oh, did I think that saved me to begin with? And for me, slothfulness. I don't want to admit I'm slothful, because that makes me bad. That separates me from the presence of God. Did I think working hard saved me? Did I think that the opposite was what brought me into the presence of God? And whenever I realized that's what I was actually saying to myself, the language of it gave me freedom. Like, oh, yeah, I did not believe that that's what saved me. So that does not separate me.
That is really good. I have had the privilege of spending a lot of time with a lot of our older members at Memorial, who have been, I mean, devoted, not just to a Sunday attendance, but I mean to the fullness of being part of Memorial Drive Church of Christ. And I know as we've got developed a more honest repertoire, beyond the, hey, come in, I'm going to teach you what to do, and then let's not talk about it, you go and do it, kind of feel of most church interaction. But for us to really share what's really going on, how do we react to scripture, and how do we think about our lives? But one of the common themes is, most of these people I'm talking to were extremely active in the body life of the church. They were the ones showing up for service days and for VBS, and I mean, they've been very engaged, teaching classes and this kind of thing. And then now, because of energy levels and health levels, and I'm not talking about now, I'm talking about pre-COVID,
Yeah.
they just felt like, I don't even know really if I'm a Christian anymore. Now they wouldn't say it that clearly, but there was this struggle, and it made me think, you and I have talked about this many times, where as people get closer to death, people that are very devoted to God, I mean, clearly are living out of the power of the Holy Spirit in their life. But as they get older, they start to really doubt, and especially on deathbed, that we just hear so much of, did I do enough? From people you would never expect that from, and I think it's because that as your life, winds down, and you have less physical energy, you start to realize, I can't do as much as I can. And if you felt like you were saved by your activity, or you measured your devotion by how many hours you put in, or how much energy you put in, well, now that you don't have that energy, then you start to ask those questions. And I think I don't say that as a critic, I say it as, that's an eye opener to me.
Yeah.
And that thought of, what is it you're holding out, that this is mine to control. But then the thought, and because your point was, when you realize your plank, that's a corollary to what you're holding outside of death to self, out of your baptism. And so your point was, if you're scared that this means you're not saved, then you need to understand, you've had this all along. You're just owning it now. You were already saved with this not being submitted to God.
Yeah. 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 And I love the thought of wanting my kids to talk to me about those things. I don't want them to go through life thinking they've got to hide weaknesses, or things that they're struggling with, or things that are keeping them from stepping into that abundant life God calls us into. I would rather them say, hey, I need help. Hey, this is true. Would you walk with me in this? And I just think God knows it's there. He's not surprised by it, and it doesn't scare him. He wants us to recognize it, and so we would draw closer to him, instead of do like Adam and Eve and run and hide in trees, finding something to shield us from God's presence.
And I'm telling you, honestly, it's some of the work that God has done in my life through you, Tim, that has helped me realize that I felt like if I hid my sin from everybody, that was godliness.
Mm,
And if I didn't talk to God about it, it almost didn't make, unless I got desperate, you know what I
yeah.
mean? But it doesn't make it real. And I'll tell you, it is heartbreaking to me as as a person who loves Jesus, as a person who loves the church, when I encounter people that have been burying stuff for years and years, and it ends up ruining their marriage, it ends up ruining their family, their job, and I just always think, man, if we could have talked about this when it started,
Yeah.
maybe 25, 30 years ago, I think it really would have helped you. Not just them talking to me, but if you felt safe to say, God, this is really a struggle, and I know you're not ashamed of me.
Yeah.
Now you want me to feel the guilt of being out of alignment with you, but that's to move me to you, not away from you.
Right.
But because church had to be, you can't tell the truth in church because it makes everybody uncomfortable. You also, I think a lot of people take on, well, you can't tell the truth to God.
You know, David Buchanan helped you and I with a perspective on one of these things we're going to be talking about, because he said when we look at this theme, I I realized that I don't struggle with that theme until I think of this area of my life, and then it is a struggle. You know, not the classic view of it, but in this area, it's like, oh my goodness, yeah, I'm that's something that I've got to take a look at, and I've got to make sure, you know, where's my focus. He didn't say it quite like that. So David, if you're watching this, forgive me if I'm misquoting or reading into your statement, but I was thinking about that idea with sloth. Or since David mentioned that, I think any of these things that we talk about, there is a corner in our life where it could be true. You know, even if for the hardest working person we know, the person who just has a 24/7 motor, they work nonstop. When you look at sloth through the lens of me not wanting to persist in doing hard things, it is not hard to imagine the hardest worker is working very hard so that they can avoid hard things. And I don't know if this is making sense, but when you're talking there, I'm thinking about families uh, that that are destroyed because somebody in the family is a super hard worker, and they are avoiding the hard work that needs to be done at home. They're avoiding the conversations with the wife, with the children, with the husband, that need to be had, work that needs to happen in the family, but they're protecting themselves from that by really digging into hard work and really being the nose to the grindstone. um, but even in that, and to think about that idea of when I was a child, I did things as a child. I bet when they were a child, they learned work hard, work so hard. That's all you do is you work hard. And eventually that became what protected them. They didn't have to deal with other people. They didn't have to mess with sticky things like emotions and hurting people's feelings, because they were just working hard. And man, there's nothing better than to say I worked hard, except for when Jesus says, hey, I invited you to the banquet. Don't tell me, but I just bought these oxen and I got to go work really hard. Come to the banquet. So there is this, each one of these things that we talk about, there is probably a corner in each of our lives where we're going to find out, oh yeah, I was lustful. Oh, I was prideful. I was slothful. I was greedy.
It's 100%. I'll tell you, I think about that work hard in when I was growing up. If you told somebody you were a preacher's kid, that either meant one of two extremes. You were super self-righteous and looked down on everybody because you were so perfect, or you were big time trouble, might get arrested, you know? And certainly there are preachers' kids today. I know your kids, Trent's kids, I mean, I know a lot of people's kids that are really you can tell a difference. But I think there is a thread there in many cases. Nothing is ever definitive across the board. But when I talk to preachers' kids who are adults and they have ongoing, separation from their parents, or their parents' marriage is imploded or whatever, a big factor of it, not everything, was the preacher was married to the church work. And what I mean by that is all of his best energy, his best ideas, his best problem solving, like he could jump into somebody else's mess and deal with their hardship all day long and offer good counsel, but then he would go home and just shut down. And the answer was, I'm a minister. I'm a minister of the
Yeah.
gospel. I've got to be out with the church. And it's ruined. I mean, it's ruined a lot of great families, great ministers' lives, because they got the signal that they can't say no, or they must always say yes to a church request. And I'll really say this about Memorial. Memorial goes out of its way as a church family to honor our families. And it's an incredible privilege. And if you're listening to this and you're a minister and you don't have that, I feel for you.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes the church is kind of aiding and abetting by, you never have any of your own time. If they have anything that comes up, you got to drop what you're doing.
Yeah.
I know preachers that never could have a whole vacation because 3 days in, 1 day in, they get a call, you got to come back now because we got this crisis.
Yeah.
And I think that's really a challenge, but it's the same thing. And I just want to take it, if you're working 8 hours a week as a CPA, there'd be a tendency, oh, that's CPA work. You know what I mean? But if you're working 80 hours a week as a minister, it's like, well, you should be doing that because that's God's work. And I'm like, well, it's all God's work, number one. And number two, your first priority is the ones you're in lifetime covenant with, not the members at a church. And so if your family doesn't come first, then what happens is it eventually hurts your ministry deeply.
Yeah. I tell you, as a preacher's kid, and dad can tell you, he can pretty much tell you the exact moment he realized, I'm doing this wrong and I've got to make a change. And he got in big trouble because he had places that were bringing him in to preach, and he called him and said, I'm canceling. And if I remember the story correctly, it was 4th of July. And he said, who's going to take my kids to see the fireworks?
Yeah, he's told me, I've heard him tell that story several times.
Yeah.
And when I first got here, so this was it was 18 years ago. It was 17 years and 342 days ago, But when I first got here, he sat down with me and he said, listen, he said this very thing. And he may have even told me that story at that point, but just the idea that you need to take your responsibility to God and you need to prioritize it as God says.
Yeah.
And I just think that is really important, whether you're a minister or not. If you're giving your best energy to your career and not to your wife and kids, you will suffer those consequences.
Yeah.
And you won't have it's not a criticism, it's just a fact.
And I remember growing up knowing dad may miss some homecomings and he may miss a couple of big events, but he could also work his schedule to be our baseball coach. And so there was a give and take. And even when he missed things, I knew he's purposeful. He's missing this, but he has been at every baseball practice and every baseball game. So there was, I really valued that growing up, and thought that's what I want to do as a dad, regardless of what job I go into. Well, I remember, this is getting off topic, but in my college years working with AIM one summer, I had a job working at a coffee shop over the summer, one of my all-time favorite jobs, where I opened. So I was into the coffee shop early, but by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that was my day. I was done. And so I had a unpaid internship that summer with this local CBS station, because I'm studying communications, and I wondered, reporting looks really fun. Maybe I want to be a reporter. And man, a week, 3 weeks, and I knew I don't want to be a reporter. these guys are going to work the same time I'm rolling in, which is 3-ish in the afternoon, and they're not going home till after the 10 o'clock news. And I thought, yeah, that I don't want that job. That would be kids coming home from school and going to bed. And man, that's not the kind of life I want to have. So it's fascinating to look at dad's decisions growing up affected jobs that I was like, yeah, that's not for me.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, for those that are watching this for the first time, there's no script to this, so we didn't like say, "Hey, then say this and say that." But it's funny. Another thing that your dad said a lot, and I tell you, the first time he said it, I was like, "You do not know what you're talking about." And the second time he said it, I'm like, "You need to show me that in the Bible." And then he did, and I was really frustrated with it. I'm like, "That can't be what it means," but it's that concept. And you got to it's the spec plank dynamic, that everything that bothers you, everything that you're like, that's got to stop, you do.
Mm-hmm.
And you reference the passage there in Romans where it's like, those of you, they're being very judgmental. And he's saying, those of you that are basically against those people that steal, don't you steal in your own way?
Mm-hmm.
Because I would go, well, I am very much against the axe murder, and I've never murdered anyone with an axe.
Yeah.
So but what's the spirit of the axe murder? It reminds me of in James 1 where he says, or maybe it's James 4, yeah, you kill and covet, and what causes fights and quarrels among you, and you kill. He's not talking about physically killing, but he's talking about these people that they're drivers, maybe their lust, they're that driver to get what you want when you want it, that's killing other people, and that fight, and it's an internal fight first and foremost, but they were placing that on everybody else, because he said, what causes fights and quarrels among you? And you're like, well, it's because you're here.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's causing this fight. And he's like, don't they come from the battles that are raging within you? And that what that means, it's like this. If you're doing something that I don't struggle with, yeah, a lot of times I won't even know what it is you're doing. Like, I won't even notice it. I'll notice it's not good or whatever, you know what I mean? But I'll kind of blow by it. But when it's something that I do, I'm already paying a lot of attention to it on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I notice it so strongly when you do it, even though for most of us, we don't put words to it. And so when you haven't taken the time to let God work on your soul and heal you and give you clarity, then you're always going to blame the other person.
Yeah.
And it's been a big Achilles in my life. It's still, I have to do a lot of work. But whenever I'm really irritated with somebody, I really try to step back and like, okay, how is this true about me?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's hard work.
I think the easiest illustration is when somebody's late and half the room is upset about it. That half is upset for completely different reasons. Each one. One person judges that person to be, and they say that it's because they're late. I mean, that's all they can imagine is I'm angry with him for being late. But if they would take a look at it, one of them thinks it's because that guy is so selfish, and another was because that guy is so uncaring. Um, and then I've thought of this. Yes, Sunday. I don't know that I talked about it because I was aware I was not doing well on time, but the slothfulness. What if somebody here they're triggered by because that sloth is two-faced? Did I say that?
No, you didn't.
Because if you landed on their two-faced, then you would go, what? What does sloth and two-faced have to do with it? But it could be legit. Oh, they say they're a hard worker, but they're not. They're really two-faced. Okay, that is a really insightful picture into your own soul. Like, that's where in your life are you two-faced? And if and your probably first reaction is, well, I'm not. Well, keep looking. There's somewhere that you, just like you said, you are attuned to it because it's about you. It's
Yeah.
your thing.
And I don't know the stats on this, and I don't even know how you'd come up with it, but basically the sense I get when I talk to people that study brain activity and the way we think and all that is that your subconscious mind is working all the time, number one, hence our dreams, and number two, um, it's working maybe more than our conscious mind, you know. So by the time I interact, even now, as I'm responding to what you say and I'm thinking through what you say, there's a big piece of that that's affected by my subconscious that I'm not aware of, and that doesn't make it evil. It just makes it, that's what's happening.
Yeah.
And so this kind of thing of when you used a phrase that I love to say because it speaks to me towards the end of your sermon where you said, the devil is this roaring lion that is the devil. He is perpetually dissatisfied. And what he has to offer you is dissatisfaction. He wants you to be dissatisfied. So that's becoming a trigger for me that when I feel dissatisfied, like a conversation's happening and I'm like, what's happening here?
Yeah.
Then I try to go, and it's muscle memory. You got to keep doing it over and over again. But I try to say, what is it that's so dissatisfying? Why can't I just listen to these people that I disagree with, or I think don't know as much as I do on the subject, or whatever it is that's making me uncomfortable? They're wasting my time, or however I feel. That those are all judgments, of course. And why can't I just sit here and be patient and just enjoy that I'm in the presence of God with 2 other people, 3 other people, 5 other whatever people that are made in God's image?
Yeah.
And it's a totally different framing of it. And the key here is when you're aware that it's a spiritual dynamic, and that's why I think this is such a fundamental and yet basic part of our rules of engagement. When I'm talking to somebody and I'm realizing dissatisfaction, when it clicks in my mind, this is a spiritual dynamic that's happening here. Then if I think, well, the devil's trying to take advantage, I am much more, if I believe that God wants me to run to him, I am much more likely to draw near to God. And that helps me in those conversations that are frustrating, or in situations that I'm frustrated with myself that I can't figure out, how do I solve this, And I think this all, because we had said this at the beginning of the devil's tactics, we'd said all these tactics are to move you into abiding into Christ. That they're all these 4 tactics are moving to do that, or the 4 rules of engagement rather, are moving you to abide in him. And that's that spirit we're doing, not that, oh no, I'm frustrated with these people, I did a bad thing. It's I'm frustrated with these people. What is it that's going on inside me that I can, in your picture, that I can take out or put in and submit to God and allow him to bring peace in this?
Yeah, man, I love hearing you talk about how you're able to connect with it in real time, because I feel like for me, it is a constant hindsight. It's looking back and going, oh, that's what was going on. So it is a continual struggle for me to capture it in real time, to own it, to get curious about it while it's happening, because you're right. I feel like that's where God's saying, hey, I've got abundant life for you if you'll pay attention right now, if you'll be aware.
So I have gluttony this week. I mean, that's my sermon topic. And I'm also gluttonous, just owning that. And so one of the things that's fascinating to me is it does show up in my life with food. Um, but it applies to everything, you know. And we were talking at one point this week, I can't remember, or last week, where we were talking about how many of the sins we talk about, like we were talking about racism, and we're like, well, where would you fit racism into these, 7 tactics dynamic? Well, it comes from a variety of places. It could be from pride, where you're like, I'm pride basically says, I am superior. I don't need you. I've got it on myself. It's a very offensive thing. And we're talking about ungodly pride. I'll try to deal with godly pride when we get there, but it's that idea of I am superior to you. I don't need you. Basically, from a unity perspective, it's pride is anti-unity. It's the idea of I don't need anybody else. I'm above, and that can surface about an individual or a group of people, so that can be a driver of racism. But there are others of these sins that can be a driver of racism too, and the racism's one. What about impatience? Well, some people are impatient because they are the anti-sloth in their mind, and nobody's working hard enough for them. And some are impatient because of their lust, their desire to have what they want right now and not being willing to do it. So these in many ways are the building blocks of the tactics that show up in our life as sins. Now they themselves are sins, of course, but they're almost the underlying sins.
Yeah.
And that's actually really helped me, because I used to think with lust, well, I just need to get rid of the visual. You know what I mean? So if you lust after vehicles, well, I just won't look at cars anymore. If you lust after people of the opposite sex, well, I just won't, look at them anymore. You know what I mean? Which is impractical, obviously, but that was the answer. But then I still realized, even when I would limit those things, I still there was still a problem underneath that. Like lust was sexual lust or lusting after possessions or whatever. That was a manifestation of a deeper need, that I had for God to satisfy me now, for God's love to satisfy me now, and the peace that comes with that. And so, and these all overlap to a degree anyway, and certainly the devil's not like, I tried lust and that didn't work. So then he's trying all of them all the time. I'm not saying he's not good at what he does, because I do believe he is good at what he does, but I do think there's that throw it all on the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've thought since we've honed in on the verse about when I was a child, I thought, man, Satan is not opposed to the long game. He's fine noticing where do we feel safe, where do we feel protected, and then building a cocoon around that. And that for me is one of my frustrating things with soul work. Wasn't life easier before we started doing soul work?
Oh, yeah.
Didn't we sleep much better when we didn't
Right.
know there's
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Wow, no, that was it.
Well, I was just going to say, it's funny. We were on the This Got Me Thinking, the Zoom call after the sermon, this a couple weeks ago, where we had drilled into lust, and somebody was saying, I'll tell you, and they were very tuned into the message, they captured it, they're really good, but they did make this observation, which is exactly what you're saying. They were like, it didn't bring life this since I got, but it was much easier when we just said, don't do it. You know? And if don't do it, and this thing I always say, if don't do it worked, then we'd still be saying don't do it.
Yeah.
But we've been saying don't do it for hundreds of years now, and it's not producing godliness. It's not producing more purity. It's not producing more self-control, And so we have to figure out a way to connect those things together.
What we got was don't tell anybody. We said
that's right.
Don't do it, but the result was just don't tell anybody. And Satan wins twice. I mean, that's
so true. So true. Well,
hey, quick commercial. So if people want to join This Got Me Thinking, how do they do that?
Okay, yeah, in the bulletin, I haven't done it well, but it'll be done this time. When you get your bulletin on Thursday, there will be it'll be the title, maybe a tiny description, but then the Zoom link will be there in your email.
Yeah.
And so it's just a matter of on Sunday at 11 a.m., just click into that. And man, it is a great, if you just want to get on and listen, you can. Everybody gets a chance, because understand the goal here isn't, we don't call it, this is what I got right, or this is a test on Tim's sermon. It's called This Got Me Thinking. And so whatever you're thinking, and sometimes people think, things that are really specific to what was said, and sometimes totally different. And man, I learn every time. Yeah. So it's a real blessing.
The other opportunity Sundays after our worship is Scott Eller is teaching upstairs. Is it at 10:15? I think at 10:15 he starts.
10:30.
10:30. Oh, okay.
We tried for 10:15, but we couldn't stop talking.
Well, that's one of the things that I've thought was I can't get up there till 10:45, and I thought, well, I'm not going to walk in 30 minutes late.
Right.
I still don't think I'll walk in 15 minutes late.
Right.
But his theme is how to survive a zombie apocalypse. And Andrea was telling, I think she was telling Kim and I where this came up for him, that she said he will always just be watching the crowds. And I can totally see this with Scott as somebody who could just sit and watch people, that he will comment constantly, they're a bunch of zombies. And what is triggering him is people seeking after life, that they're looking in the wrong places and they're just going around mindlessly going to the next thing, missing the life that is there in front of them. So I'm betting it is just an excellent study.
I bet too. I bet too. So yeah, it's 10:30 at Eastside, upstairs in the parables room.
Yeah.
So very good. Well, thank you,
Socially
Tim.
distanced.
Yeah, socially distanced. There you go. Thank you, Tim. Hope you have a good week.
Yeah, you too. You too.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.